Thank you so much for coming on a night that was a little drizzly. Woo, you okay? It's great to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. And for our friends that are joining us via 1623 Studios, I welcome you as well. Thank you so much for coming to meet our distinguished speaker. Tonight it's Petra Slinkard. Petra Slinkard, forgive me. Petra Slinkard from the Peabody Essex Museum, which we consider to be a jewel box in our community, and I am sure you all agree. We are so privileged to live in an area that is adjacent to Peabody Essex Museum. It's filled with wonders, and presently I'd like to encourage you to see Sinners, Saints, and Lovers and Fools, my clothes.
Yeah, you're perfect.
The craftsmanship of the Flemish painting is stunning, and I encourage you to see it. It's filled with passion and whimsy and lust, which is very appropriate because tomorrow is Valentine's Day. So I wish you all a good Galentine's Day if that's the case. But tonight we are featuring Petra because she has an overview of fascinating women that have contributed much to our culture in terms of their entrepreneurial sense and being women of passion for fashion, much like our speaker this evening. She has an overview of an enormous collection, because it's from the Peabody Essex Museum, it's quite historically valuable. It's also emotionally valuable because many of the pieces in the collection at the Peabody Essex Museum reference a time when women were not allowed agency and they did not speak except through their clothing. And what did their clothing tell you about a time? Petra also is a person that looks beyond that frame of reference and can look into the future. And she has cultivated brilliant artisans that look at fashion in an outrageous, edgy way. And Petra embraces that, being the curator that she is. Petra blew in from Chicago, if I could say that, sure, to Salem in 2018. And she started her association with the Peabody Essex Museum, and one of the things that one of her colleagues said is that Petra likes to walk to work, and one of the reasons she likes to walk to work is not only to experience the antiquity of Salem, but the edginess of Salem. And I think that you will see that this evening when she reviews the collections of women that I think have established themselves as pioneers and trailblazers in fashion. These are women that were not necessarily promoted to be fashionistas, but they chose this path for themselves. And what's also distinguished those women is they were on their own. They were not behind their husbands or behind their partners, but they were very much leading the way. And I see Petra as a person that's doing that, if you don't mind my bragging on you. I see Petra doing that through the collection at Peabody Essex Museum. So I think that I encourage you to enjoy the collection, which this evening is primarily going to feature works from Iris Apfel, an icon in fashion. And she had an exotic quality and a global quality, and she reached beyond anything that seemed pedestrian, and she went beyond that to include the greater perspective of man. And then our local gal, Yolanda Salucci, I don't know how she got from here all the way to Hollywood, and Bob Mackie, and she never met a sequence she didn't like. So I feel very, very connected to Miss Yolanda. So all of that ties into, I think, finally, one of Petra's other inclusions is the workmanship and the stewardship of Coco Chanel, who in a post-war culture, in a society that was not looking to promote women, in a post-war culture, Coco Chanel became a woman that redesigned femininity by basing her styles very much on a man's look, and then she feminized it. So all of these women, including Petra, I think are worthy of recognition, and it's a privilege to welcome you tonight to our distinguished speaker series. Thank you, Petra.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. Thank you all. I'm going to stand here, if that's okay. Does that sound all right? Is this okay? Okay. It is cold. Is the feedback? Is it bothering? I can sit over here too. Can I trade places with you?
Sure.
Yeah? I think if I step away. All right. This should be better. All right, well, now I'm going to sit as long as everyone can see me, if that's all right with you.
But first we have to see the skirt.
Oh.
This is what a fashionista wears. All right.
Thank you, Diane. Okay. Well, we have a lot in store for you today, so thank you very much for being here. I know that it is cold and it is wet, so it means even more to me that you ventured out this evening. There are some familiar faces in the audience, but lots of faces that are new to me. So I feel privileged to share this evening with you, and thank you very much to Diane and the Manchester by the Sea Cultural Council and Maddie and 1623 as well. So as Diane said, I'm going to go into a few little deep dives on some women that the Peabody Essex Museum has the pleasure of housing in their collection. But to begin, this was really intended as kind of an opportunity to think about what is at the core of the Peabody Essex Museum's collection, and that is that we are a collection of collections. And I offer that because, I'm sure many of you are collectors in your own right. So if you think about those, groupings, those gatherings of things that you love, that you nurture, and then if you were going to give that over to someone to care for, and what an eclectic and interesting, amalgamation that might turn into as you continue to grow and gather those collections. And really, because of what I do as the curator of fashion and textiles, this is also about sort of navigating design and creative expression, because creative expression is really at the heart of what we're doing in the mission of the Peabody Essex Museum, is sort of exploring those various avenues, techniques, and ways in which people, dig deep and express themselves, whether that's through high art, such as Saints, Sinners, Lovers, and Fools, in regard to Flemish masterworks, to photography, to fashion, to industrial design, and that all of it is accepted as a thing of beauty and as a thing that may enable people to learn more about one another. So, we're PEMIS, but just to ground you, in case you haven't made it to the museum lately, this is the entrance to the museum. And, as I mentioned, a collection of collections, this is really where we began. And so just giving you kind of a little historical overview of how the museum once was situated in Salem in two disparate institutions that both evolved in their own right over time. And Diane had mentioned historical dress, and that is really at the heart of the Peabody Essex Museum's collection because it represents the people of Essex County. But in addition to that, clothing, accessories, textiles were also some of the very first and most collected objects of the East India Marine Society. And so I think that that's really interesting because it gave, to Diane's point, a moment for women's work, for women and their identity to be collected at a time when women's work and women were not really necessarily focused on with regularity. And so thinking about all the ways in which we've grown and changed provided us with opportunities to think differently about the works that we already have in our collection, resituating them in new contexts, and then also looking at and thinking about what is design. And so as we go through, we at the museum and through our own lens consider design to be everywhere. It is all around us. It is in this beautiful building, it's in the automobiles that brought you here, the roads that were designed to bring you here, to the technology that we're using now. And so all of that was the thesis that underscored our fashion and design gallery. And the crux of that gallery is really built around humanity. That we design for our bodies and our environments and our societies, and that is what underscores this impulse, this need to create. And that need, that impulse, is in fact what unifies us. And so as we go through, this is just an overview of the gallery, and we think about the various ways in which we engage with fashion and design. It can range from intricacy and technique to notions of empowerment, grandness to domestic textiles, And the reason that I bring all of this up, and there is a point to this, is for us to think broadly, to think expansively about what it means to be a global individual with an eye to fashion and design. And so really it's about expression, as I said, self-expression, this notion of how you adorn yourself every day. You know, I don't dress today for this event the same way that I will dress on Saturday when I'm at home with my cats. You know, that's okay. That's encouraged. Thank you very much. I know the cats, I have to take it off immediately. But this idea that, you know, there is, in a sense, this range of beauty that embodies different cultures and different time periods. And, you know, as we think about the way that we've collected and adorned ourselves, it becomes a blueprint. It becomes a document of not only individuality, but also of society. And so one of the individuals that I'm going to actually start with is Marilyn Reisman. Marilyn Reisman is a contemporary of Yolanda Salucci's. She passed away in 2015, and she owned a boutique called Apogee. And Apogee was an avant-garde boutique in Boston, and she said frequently that she wanted to be as avant-garde as the materials that she carried in her store. And so she came to the museum and saw the Iris Apfel exhibition, the Rare Bird of Fashion exhibition, in 2009. And then she came back a few years later when the museum debuted an exhibition on avant-garde Japanese fashion. And at that point, given her affection for Japanese avant-garde fashion, she said, this is the place. This is the place that I know that I want to give my collection. So the museum acquired over 700 pieces from Marilyn's wardrobe. And, you know, I show this slide because this is just a snip from our cataloging, because her wardrobe is very monochromatic. She essentially wore black and white, sometimes a little beige. Every once in a while she did throw in an accented neutral, and by accented neutral I mean like a red or a green or something that sort of like adds a pop of color. She always wore a black wig and full kabuki makeup. I've had the pleasure of speaking with individuals who lived in her building and said, you know, every once in a while you'd catch Marilyn without her makeup as she was like sort of taking out her trash, but most of the time it was, you know, full face. And I love that, because she was creating an identity that she was presenting to the world. And there was no fear. Well, maybe, I can't say, I don't actually know. But I think that there is a sense of sort of putting on a bit of armor as we engage, you know, with the world, and particularly as women, entrepreneurs or otherwise. I think there's an element of that we do consciously and subconsciously on a daily basis. So I want you to hold this image in your mind as we're looking at these black and white ensembles, because it also nicely contrasts with another individual that we have in our collection. And these are more examples of the museum's collection. And then I'm going to get there. And then we get to Iris Apfel. So as I said, you know, this notion that fashion and design can be intricate, can be empowering, can be about self-expression. But for Iris Apfel, it was really her entire life. And so what you're seeing on the screen here are three ensembles from the Rare Bird of Fashion collection. They are nestled among Gustavo. Gustavo is the hand-carved Italian ostrich that was also a dry bar. We acquired Gustavo with the Rare Bird of Fashion collection. Gussie, his partner, lived with Iris until she passed just this last year in Palm Beach. And, you know, it was so interesting because I don't know if you can tell on the screen, but there's also glassware on the dry bar. And that glassware was a collaboration that Iris did with Nude glassware. And it's an example of how, you know, Iris continued to design literally until, you know, she passed away. And so reinforcing that notion that design can be your life became the heart of the Fashion and Design Gallery. And in a way, Iris became the heart of the Fashion and Design Gallery. Here are some examples from the Rare Bird of Fashion collection. Her travels, her entrepreneurial spirit, her business acumen that was met every day, toe to toe, with her husband Carl. They married in 1950, and they began a collection, a business where they were embarking in interior design. And because they could not find textiles that they liked, that they felt were sufficient, they went out into the world and they found them, and they worked with artisans. And those travels are what enabled Iris to begin crafting her own identity, sort of mining her own creative expression. And she collected jewelry from everywhere. She haggled with, salespeople in the markets, and many ensembles that they had, she created whole cloth from old world weavers' textiles. And so this really, what the museum discovered when we launched the exhibition in 2009 is that something clicked with the people of the North Shore. They started to feel, or express at least to individuals at the museum, that they too could go into their closets and maybe try something different, or pull something out from the back that they haven't worn in a long time because maybe they felt a little sheepish, or perhaps that it was inappropriate. But that Iris offered people of all ages agency to be themselves and to dress and carry themselves in a way that offered pride, but also distinction. And that's one of the things, I think, the legacies that she really leaves behind for us. Here are a couple of examples of textiles that were made for old world weavers that she also made into clothing. So if you ever hear people say, oh, well, you're wearing the couch, Iris absolutely did. She also and her husband Carl designed for 9 sitting presidents. Each time the White House turns over, they redo the interiors, and they had the opportunity to participate in that. And then, behind many strong women, not all, is a strong partner. And in Iris's case, that was Carl Apfel. And so to sort of reinforce the affection that I think Iris had for the Peabody Essex Museum, when I came on board in 2018, was the first time that I had the opportunity to meet Iris. Unfortunately, Carl had already passed. He passed away at the age of 100. And the year later, she bequeathed all of Carl's clothes to PEM. So not only do we have over 1,000 objects in our collection that represent Iris Apfel, but we have over 350 that represent Carl. And to me, that was really one of the most beautiful gestures of her belief in the Peabody Essex Museum. And I don't think that I'm sharing too much by saying that, when we were there in her apartment packing up her clothes, there were moments where we would see her, hold the lapel of one of his sport coats, just before we were putting it away. And I think that like enduring love on Galentine's Day is kind of a nice thing to share. But she lived boldly and proudly. And if you've seen the documentary of Iris Apfel, that is absolutely 100% her. Absolutely. She did not, there was no pretense. I would go and visit with her, and it was usually saltine crackers, maybe a tuna salad, some hot tea, and always cookies. She did have very much a sweet tooth. So it was a pleasure and an honor to be able to work on that collection and to meet her. And we have situated Iris and Carl in the heart of the Fashion and Design Gallery. And here are just some close-ups. Every year we do a variety of rotations, so it's always in flux and changing. So there's always something new to see. And then to keep going, just to give you a final visual tour of the gallery, we have an opportunity, again, for people to express themselves. And I'm going to pause here for just a moment because we're always rotating. And Diane brought up Yolanda Salucci. So during COVID, we received an email from Yolanda Salucci who said, I've got some clothes. Do you think you want to take a look? And I was like, okay. So I had to figure out, for me, not growing up here, who's Yolanda Salucci? And so I did that. And of course, a whole, Pandora's box opened to me. And she said, well, I have these clothes, I've given things to LaSalle University, I've given things to the MFA, but these are things that I've really hung on to, and now I'm ready to, give them over. And so not only did the museum have the opportunity to acquire what remained of her fashion collection, and that's things that she personally wore, and things that she sold in her store. But we also were able to acquire her library and her archives, which is really wonderful because it includes a number of newspaper clippings, store advertisements. It includes runway or fashion show pamphlets. So there's a rich and deep sort of material culture associated with her collection as well. And we're always doing rotations in our gallery, as I said. And so many of those decks that you saw that were sort of an overview of the museum's collection, so featuring works from Korea, featuring the 1920s beaver coat, that all changed to focus on Yolanda. And we use the tagline that fashion and design can be dazzling. Because if you know Yolanda Saliucci, you know that, as Diane said, there was not a sequence that she has met that she did not like. But the heart of Yolanda's story is really what drew me in. Yolanda began making clothes for herself in high school because she didn't have the income, or her family couldn't afford necessarily to buy fancy dresses for prom. And she says that her sewing skills were okay, and she was able to make great clothes, but it wasn't enough. And so she would literally bedazzle these clothes in an effort to add some pizzazz, and that of course made her stand out. And then Yolanda had a child. She got married, she grew up, she had a child. And during that phase of her life, she experienced some hair loss. And she began wearing turbans and began wearing wigs. And people would stop her on the street and say, wow, you look fantastic. Like, what are you wearing? And she decided, okay, there's something here. And so she began working with other women who had experienced hair loss, either due to cancer or because of alopecia, or whatever the reason may be, stress. She started selling wigs and turbans, at first out of the trunk of her car. And then that grew into a beauty business that took over. And eventually, through many years of hard work, again, in partnership with her husband, she created Yolanda's. And here's just one of the many historic photos from Yolanda's. But the thing that I love about Yolanda, like Marilyn Reisman, like Iris Apfel, there is a distinctiveness to her look. And if you think about Marilyn Reisman and her very stark black and white avant-garde look, and Yolanda Saliucci. When I met Yolanda for the first time, it was in an alleyway, entering a garage that was where her clothing was stored, and it was August. So I was wearing a black, cotton dress and flip-flops, and Yolanda rolls up looking flawless, head to toe white, beautiful bouffant, white high heel shoes, and then invites us over afterwards for tea and cookies. So there's a little bit of a tea and cookie theme here. But the thing also about Yolanda that I think really stands out is that not only was she a very successful entrepreneur, but she did not waver. She told us stories that, there were times when she'd be invited to do charity fashion shows, and then she'd show up with her girls, with her clothes, which are very distinctive in their look, as you can see from the screen. And people would say, oh, no, we made a mistake. That's not our crowd. I don't know if we, and she said, no, just let me do what I do. And then, of course, it was a huge success. Lots of money was raised, and she was, hired back year after year. And that kind of tenacity, that kind of eye, that kind of brilliance, that kind of fearlessness is one of the things that I really think stand out about Yolanda. And she is still living. She just celebrated her 90th birthday. She is still coming to fashion events. I had one earlier in January, and she came out. She's extremely supportive of students, of fashion design, and otherwise. And she's just a really fantastic woman. So this is the installation overview that is currently up until we do our next rotation, which is in early 2026. And that will be a focus on the 400 years of Salem. Many of you who are from this area know that Gloucester celebrated their 400th in 2023, and Salem is celebrating theirs in 2026. So we're excited for that changeover. And here are a couple more images. And then you had mentioned Coco Chanel, and so
I like Coco Chanel as well. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I did add a few images here just to wrap us up, because you wanted to, I think, bring into light another historical sort of powerhouse figure. This is a label from an exhibition that the Peabody Essex Museum did in 2020. It was 2020, so of course it was not the best visited exhibition that we've had, but it was important for us to do that exhibition because it was featured on women fashion designers. It was entitled Made It, the Women Who Revolutionized Fashion. And it was in partnership with a Dutch institution in Den Haag, the Kunstmuseum. And we were fortunate to work with them. We borrowed a number of pieces from them and then also supplemented with Pem's collection. And you can't do an exhibition around women fashion designers without including Gabrielle Coco Chanel. Chanel is sometimes considered a controversial figure. She, again, did what she did in order to survive. She made brilliant business decisions. Culturally, she made questionable decisions. But she, her legacy, of course, continues in both the house and in then the legacy of Karl Lagerfeld. And so I just include these few details of this classic uniform, because if you think about a comeback story, this here is Chanel's comeback story. So Chanel really, gained a lot of fame and momentum, of course, in the 1920s and the 1930s. And then because of the Second World War, she dropped out of sight, went into hiding. And then when Christian Dior in 1947 came on the scene and was reacting to all of those wartime regulated 1940s suits, she said, oh, no, that will not stand. I'm not going to see this man put women back in corsets, envelop them in yards and yards and yards of skirtage, and that's not going to work for me. And so her response to that is, of course, the classic Chanel suit, which strangely didn't actually do that well in Europe, but in the American market, as the American woman in the 20th century was really finding her way in the workplace and in other areas, they really responded to this. And so it has become a uniform of sorts that is, again, put on like armor. And so here is the same ensemble in the gallery. As an inside joke, I positioned it next to Schiaparelli. They were known for many years to be arch nemesis, so I had fun with that. And then here are a few examples of other Chanels from over the years. And so you can see where she began and where she eventually went. And then, of course, this is an ensemble that we have in our collection, designed by the House of Chanel by Karl Lagerfeld in 1991, taking that Chanel suit, turning it on its head, doing it in denim with a white t-shirt, which would also not have stood during Mademoiselle's time. But I think it's kind of a nice way to end, because you spoke of edginess and sort of the future of fashion. So I think that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Yes. We have time. Hold on. Our partner, the Manchester Public Library, has been very kind throughout the season. This series started last February with General Hammond, Brigadier General Jack Hammond, and throughout the year we've gone in a number of eclectic ways, and throughout the series we've been heard and unheard, even though we've tried to speak up. Maddie, through the generosity of the library, has purchased this microphone for us, so hopefully it made a nice addition and you could hear us all the way back in the deeper seats. So Maddie, would you like to have everybody in town test out the microphone? Do you have questions for us?
Anybody have a question?
Yes. When did she become Coco Chanel?
I'm sorry?
When did she become Coco Chanel?
Oh, that was a nickname that was given to her, and it became a bit of an inside gesture, among friends and family. And then it was something that just kind of stuck a little bit later, but when she was very young. And it traveled with her.
Anyone else have a question? Raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic.
It's brand new.
How do we store so much inventory?
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, it's a work in progress. We have sites of storage all over our main campus in Salem, and then we have a new collection center in Rowley. In fact, we're doing a massive move of our fashion and textile collection at the moment, which is really wonderful. The storage previously was a little harder to reach, and so doing this kind of work, it's nice to have immediate access to things. We're working with collection stewards, and they're organizing things by designer, by decade, and that will enable us then also to welcome people like yourself, but also scholars, students, etc., who might say, I'm interested in Chanel's, what do you have? And this way they're all together, and we can facilitate those kinds of visits with greater ease. Yes.
Will you be offering tours of the new facility and chats like we're having this evening?
We do, yes. And if you are interested, I'd be happy to share that information. But yeah, we definitely, if you are a member of the Peabody Essex Museum, we do lots of members tours. And we also do public tours every once in a while. Yes, Jackie.
If you could write a book on what you would like to acquire,
Oh.
over time, versus, versus the things that people say they want to include in your collection to you. Are there things that you're looking for to fill in the gaps?
That's a great question. Yes. So it's interesting because on the one hand, I very much appreciate when people step forward because that's how you learn about stories that you didn't know existed. And it's one thing, for museums to emulate one another's collections, and there is a strategy to that. That's not a strategy that I adopt or employ because to me, if you want to see things that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has in their Costume Institute, you should go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So what I like to do, particularly through the lens of PEM, which in its way is very broad, is to think about, again, entrepreneurship, because that's in a way at the heart of the sea captain's story. But also, the people who lived and continue to live within Essex County, within Boston, New England area. But then also thinking about global fashion from a contemporary lens. So I'd say if I had all the money in the world and all the time in the world, I would probably grow the collection with an eye to emerging global fashion designers. And I do pay attention. I try to sort of track their movements. There's some really fabulous fashion weeks happening in Johannesburg or in Turkey or in Mexico City. But we have a tendency to think of New York, London, Paris, Milan. But fashion weeks are happening all over the world. And I think that's really where I'd like to spend my time. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great talk. I was thinking about the Met's Sleeping Beauties. Do you have any pieces that are particularly hard to display or store?
We do. Yeah, that was an interesting exhibition. Well, fashion is not easy. There's nothing about fashion that's easy, particularly from a museum perspective. Wrangling mannequins, conservation of clothing and textiles, they're inherently fragile. And so there's a lot of kind of care and feeding that goes into these kinds of collections. But believe it or not, some of the oldest works are in sometimes the best condition because of the natural fibers. So if you think about a linen or a wool or a cotton, those textiles were really made to last and they don't have an inherent degradation to them. Whereas I have seen, 1960s go-go boots that are completely falling apart. tennis shoes. Also, you know, there's that plastic, anything that's made from PVC is going to inherently degrade. And so if you have plastic things that you love and care about, store them in the cold. That's the best way. It won't stop the degradation, but it will slow it down. Fur also, I'm sure all of you know, if you do have fur or wool, to store them in the cold also helps. But, you know, trying to kind of track some of that. And then, you know, Pam is fortunate because we just purchased a nitrogen bubble, which sounds really weird, but it is truly a bubble, like a big plastic bubble. And we put things in it, and then the nitrogen enters, and it basically forces out or sucks out all the oxygen. And so anything that may have been living is no longer. So that helps. Wow. I think there was another question.
Yes, yeah.
Where do you go when you need to have something repaired? Is it in
Oh.
the house, or do you take it to specialists around?
So typically, we will work with a number of conservators, depending on what it is. But specifically with fashion and textiles, we work really closely with Windsor Studio, which is run by Deirdre Windsor, who's a really phenomenal textile conservator.
I have a question back here.
So 2 questions. What's your fashion story? What drew you to a career in fashion? And the second question is, if you could see any item of clothing from any historical person, what would it be?
Wow.
Okay. Whew, that's a good one. Okay, so what's my fashion story? Okay, so it's funny, maybe. I think it's funny. I actually don't consider myself fashionable. I think that I have style, like I understand what works and what doesn't and what I feel good in. But I would never say that I'm fashionable in the sense that I'm like trendy or chasing, you know, what is fashionable. That I know it can be an amazing experience for people, but in that way, I'm a little bit lazy because I just don't have the time or the money to follow everything to the T. But that doesn't mean that I don't love it. And so the way that I think I've developed my style is I was raised by a fabulous sort of village of really strong women. And I had 2 sisters. One was 20 years older than me, and one was 10 years older than me. My mother, I have 10 cousins on my mother's side. My Oma, my Dutch grandmother, and her sister, my grandmother, who's like a meat and potatoes Hoosier, all of them had very, very wildly different styles. But because I was so young, I spent a lot of time like in the bathroom watching them get ready. And that was a transformative experience for me, because I learned not only how to do different things, sort of based on which individual it was that I was engaging with, but I think it developed in me an appreciation of how wildly different people can look and present themselves, and yet still be beautiful. And so when I was younger, going back to entrepreneurs, my parents were entrepreneurs. They owned a business together. And I always sort of had an entrepreneurial spirit, but I wanted to be a fashion designer. And somehow I couldn't quite commit. And so, you know, sometimes like when you feel like you have someone pushing you in a direction and you don't see them, I feel like that was kind of what was happening. And so I went interior design, which was not what anyone expected. And I didn't end up staying with interior design, but that opened a door to me to art history. And then I discovered on my university's campus a fashion collection, which was a social history collection. And those 2 things together really clicked for me, because I found myself in love with the stories that were being shared in my art history class, but very bored around the conversations of, you know, genre and technique and, you know, schools and things of that nature. And I kept thinking, like, I'm really interested in this, but I'm still kind of bored and not totally fully engaged. Is there a way to incorporate fashion history into the narratives of art history? And then I realized that there were people doing that, and that I had the opportunity to learn from them. And so I volunteered everywhere and did everything. From stage costumes to working at the Kinsey Institute to doing paper conservation. I mean, if it was involved in preservation or museum work, I kind of cobbled together my own path. And then I was fortunate enough to be trusted to continue to do this work. So I think, my fashion story, I think, is one that's rooted in narrative and, trying to connect people to something that they didn't know. And, frequently I like to say, and one of my coworkers is here, that my target audience when we're doing an exhibition is the person who loves fashion and the person who's like, absolutely not, that's not for me. Because I want that person to walk out of the gallery feeling like something in them has changed. And so if I can meet both of those people where they are, then I've done my job. Whose wardrobe would I like to see? Oh my. There are so many. Fortunately we have, Princess Diana's wardrobe and Jacqueline Onassis' wardrobe, available to people. I think for me, I would love to see what Cleopatra actually wore. I would have loved to have gotten a glimpse at like Peggy Guggenheim's wardrobe. I think just Josephina Baker, like, to be able to be with them in present moment and sort of see them shine, I think would have been an absolute treat. I have no idea how we're doing on time.
We have 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. Do you have questions for me?
I do have a question, but I'd really encourage the audience to ask Petra while we have her. This is such a great treat to have Petra. But moving forward, if no one else is around, Pam,
we've got one more.
I misspoke.
So, who do you see in contemporary or beyond contemporary that you have an eye for that will become one of these icons?
One of these icons? Ooh, that's a good question. Okay. I could be wrong. I don't actually totally love her. But I think that, two people I think are interesting in our contemporary pop culture. I think that Miley Cyrus is a very interesting fashion palette. She is fearless. I don't always agree with many of the decisions that she's made, but I think as we've watched her grow from a teenager to the woman that she is now, we've seen a lot of evolution in the way that she's decided to style herself. And she's only barely late 20s, maybe. So there's a lot of life left there. And I do think that there is some potential for her to evolve, I think, into a very interesting, perhaps eccentric fashion plate. I think that Zendaya is also, not only is she beautiful and stately, but she has the ability to go from, totally casual kind of streetwear to, the most beautiful sort of statuesque, almost Audrey Hepburn-like formality that I think takes a lot of self-confidence and a lot of kind of self-awareness to be able to switch and evolve in that way. And so again, as a very young woman, I'll be intrigued to see how her style develops and evolves over time.
What about designers?
Oh, and designers. Oh, I'm sorry. I may have misunderstood your question. Oh, gosh. Well, that's a good question. Fashion's in a weird place right now. There's so much emphasis on the corporate and like the corporate lens sort of leading and guiding, I think, some of the independent creatives, that if you strip that away, there are, some great designers that I think could have a lot of fun. I think that Maria Grazzi Chiuri is the first woman to run Christian Dior, has been doing interesting work. She has a great sense of art history. She works with, globally renowned artists to provide backdrop and context to her collections. we've lost some great designers over the last couple of years. I mean, Terry Mugler was phenomenal, in my opinion, as far as an artist is concerned, because there is that line between creating and sort of pushing commercially successful clothing, which I think a Calvin Klein or a Ralph Lauren does very well. And there's no shame in that. But there is a distinction then, I think, between what becomes like runway or wearable art, and you do have artists, you know, that have done that quite well. Yes.
Do you get inquiries from the film industry, and how do you work with them?
That's a great question. Every once in a while, we do. Usually a costume designer will email or call and say, okay, I'm looking for a travel bag from the 1880s, and it has to be, you know, for someone who is, you know, of a lower income and, you know, maybe had some rough road, and, you know, that's a hard request because I can provide examples, but it's almost like you have to work in that creative process with someone to evolve those designs. The other thing is, you know, frequently designers, I mean, Vivienne Westwood was known for, you know, mining the V&A's collection, but a lot of costume designers will also engage with dealers. So the vintage dealers that are out and about these days are wildly informed and also providing a lot of really interesting product. Because there is this massive turnover, I think, in population growth that is leading to, you know, vintage items becoming available in a way that they weren't before. But mostly I would consider a costume designer reaching out to us as a research request like any other. We've had people come and, you know, study, measure to the absolute last detail corsetry in order to get that correct. And it's always really fun to see. And I worked, not PEM related, but I worked for a while, as Diane said, in Chicago at the Chicago History Museum, and they house some of the wardrobe of Mary Todd Lincoln. And so, for instance, when the Daniel Day-Lewis film Lincoln was done, and Sally Field, who of course is of a small stature, was playing Mary Todd Lincoln, the costume designers went there and they took measurements of Mary Todd Lincoln's clothing and then graded it out to fit Sally Field. But you can see a one-to-one replica of some of those clothes too. Yes?
Petra, I think your talk has been great in that it's highlighted what I think one of PEM's strengths is, in that, for instance, with Iris Apfel, it's not just clothes and accessories, it's a whole personality, especially with Carl, that PEM doesn't just do two-dimensional art, does three-dimensional, but it backs it up with the two-dimensional, or whether it's with the ostrich. And the fact that you got to meet some of the donors certainly rounds out what you then get to present. And I think that's what sets PEM apart in many ways compared to other institutions, that it's not just dresses.
Thank
and
you.
then we're done. And you have presented that, I think, very well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, I strive for it to not just be dresses, but I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that PEM's collection at its core is a collection of everyday three-dimensional objects. What makes some of those works rare is the time in which they were created, or the materials with which they were created, or the culture from within it comes. But there is definitely a cross-cultural current and a cross-time period current that occurs in the work that we do. And, you know, and I have to say, my colleagues and I are really, really collaborative. Rarely, you know, to Jackie's question about, you know, what would I want to collect? If I was going to be, you know, working with an Indigenous fashion designer, I would be working with Karen Kramer, our curator of Native American art. If I'm working with a contemporary European designer, you know, I may engage Trevor Smith, our curator of contemporary art. Yao Wu, our new curator of Chinese art, and I work together. So there's always, I think what's important, and one of the things that the museum has excelled in, is that there's not a singular lens that is applied. Because if it was always just what I think all the time, that would get really boring also. And that doesn't do the public any service, because I think it creates kind of a false sense of reality. You have to have those multiple perspectives and those multiple voices that help shape a collection, because it truly should be referencing, of the collective.
Exactly, it's more embracing.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Can you tell us about the upcoming exhibits?
Oh, that is the best question. Thank you. Yes, we have a couple of things. So 25 is a big year. 25 and 26 are going to be big years. So this September, we are opening an exhibition on a Singaporean Paris-based fashion designer named Andrew Gin. It's Andrew and then GN is his last name. Andrew's story and collection is really interesting, and we felt a really great fit for PEM. He was born and raised in Singapore. I don't know how much you all know about Singapore. I didn't know as much as I do now previously, but Singapore has a really interesting kind of, almost kind of a parallel storyline to Salem as a port city that really gained its economic growth and then subsequent independence in 1965. And he was born just after. And so in a way, he kind of embodies this arc of Singapore's rise. And Singapore is an interesting place because it has so many different cultures that come together. So you see Portuguese, Malay, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Peranakan, which is a Singaporean specific terminology that represents individuals of multiple ethnicities. And Andrew is a collector of all things. He collects people, he loves food, he has traveled all over, he speaks 7 languages. He's just this sort of enigmatic person. And all of that, all of those impulses channel into his clothing. And so his clothing is really done at a very fine level. He and his husband have owned their business for 28 years. They just closed, and in that time they were able to maintain their independence. And all of his design cues are taken from Indonesian boutique or Chinese export porcelain, French contemporary and modern ceramics, English gardens, Marie Antoinette. I mean, he sort of is this peripatetic thinker and draws these inspirations in from all over art history, popular culture, and Asian art history. And so that's going to open in September. It will be a full sort of visual, colorful, I think, delight, layered in textures and embroideries and laces. And then, as I said, in 26, we're doing another major rotation in our fashion and design gallery with an eye to Salem's 400th anniversary. And then also in the fall, our gala this year will be on the theme of global fashion. So we will hopefully be working with lots of independent fashion designers from our area and abroad to bring their work to the museum. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you asking.
I think that's it. You've covered the world, like wide world of sports. It's the wide world of Petra.
Thank
you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening, and thank you for welcoming our distinguished speaker. Petra is clearly a gem in our culture, and I feel as though she's been a wonderful asset, and I hope you've enjoyed her as much as we've enjoyed having her. Thank you, Petra.
Thank you.
And I didn't tell even one story that Whitney told.